Eating a carnivore diet led to full resolution of my autoimmune condition, eczema, itchy rashes, and asthma that I'd had for my whole life. But after a year and a half, I quit the carnivore diet. In this video, I'm gonna tell you why and talk about the pros and cons of eating carnivore. So from the outset, I wanna say that a carnivore diet, eating only animal foods, meat, fish, chicken, eggs, animal fat, organs, salt plus minus, some people eat coffee on this type of diet, is an incredibly powerful way of eating. It's an elimination diet, and it's helped so many people, including myself, reverse autoimmune diseases, get to the bottom of which foods are triggering their gut issues. It's helped a lot of people lose weight and feel massively better overall. I mean, I am such a fan of the carnivore diet that I wrote a book about it in 2019, which is still something that I'm proud of, and I still agree with many of the ideas talked about in that book. But if you are eating a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet and you are thriving, this video is not meant to change your mind. If anything, this video is meant to be a high five, keep doing what you're doing, keep thriving, and I'm glad that you found a way of eating that works for you. But I know that, like myself, there are a lot of people who eat carnivore or ketogenic diets and they run into issues. The point of this video is to offer those of you that might be doing carnivore or keto and struggling, maybe with some of the same things that I struggled with, another way or other ways of thinking about diet to help you get back on track for health. Again, this video is not to knock carnivore, it's not to knock keto, it's not to tell you to stop eating that way. If you're thriving, keep doing it. This is what I keep saying in my social media content over and over. If you're thriving, don't change anything about your diet. But if you're not, whether you're having sleep issues or muscle cramps or low libido or weight loss plateau or any of these things, it's time to question your nutritional assumptions, and there are other ways of thinking about diets. So what happened with me? After about a year to a year and a half of a carnivore diet, I began to notice issues, probably in my case arising due to electrolyte insufficiency, connected with consistently very low insulin because I wasn't really eating any carbohydrates, and the protein I was eating probably wasn't as insulinogenic as it needed to be. This led to muscle cramps, I had problems with sleep, I had heart palpitations, fluttering of my heart, I had something called hypnagogic jerks where I would fall asleep but jerk myself awake like I was falling multiple times. That was very stressful and very traumatic. It led to very poor sleep for a little while. That eventually was possibly remedied by magnesium IVs, but the reason I got low in magnesium in the first place was probably due to a ketogenic diet in my case. I had declining lab values that were important to me, specifically lower total testosterone, higher sex hormone binding globulin, which leads to a lower free testosterone, and a lower free testosterone index. And I had the sense that I was cold or a little bit cold all the time. And when I looked at my labs, my thyroid levels, specifically my total T3 and free T3, were not ideal. In my case, after a year to a year and a half on a ketogenic carnivore diet of only meat, organs, and fat and salt, I began to have some issues, and I started to think about what I could do to remedy those issues. I'll talk about what I think all of these were connected with in this video, but ultimately the solution for me was adding back carbohydrates. If any of you have followed my story in the past, you know where this goes. I've since transitioned to something that I think of as an animal-based diet where I still eat meat and organs, animal fat and salt, but I get carbohydrates from things like fruit, honey, and raw dairy. And I'll talk about my decisions or why I choose those as my carbohydrate sources later in this video. Now, interestingly, as you can imagine, when I added fruit to my diet and honey to my diet, the carnivore community was a little bit shaken by this, a little bit traumatized, and there were many in the carnivore community and continue to be those in the carnivore community suggesting that I did the carnivore diet wrong. Does this sound familiar? This is a lot of times what happens in vegan circles when people leave veganism, and then the vegans that are still doing a vegan diet accuse them of doing a vegan diet wrong. People said that I ate too many organs, and that was the reason that I didn't do well on a carnivore diet. Well, I eat the same amount of organs now with carbohydrates, and I feel much better. So I don't think that was the problem. I suppose people have proposed all sorts of other convoluted reasons why a carnivore diet didn't work for me. And as I said in the beginning of the video, I know a carnivore diet works for a lot of people, but I think there are a lot of us out there also that strictly eating meat or eating meat and organs doesn't really cut it long term, because I think that for most people, carbohydrates are a valuable part of human physiology, and I'll talk about why. As I mentioned earlier, I think one of the main things that went wrong with me was not having enough carbohydrates. And though insulin, a peptide hormone, gets demonized, I think insulin is actually our friend, and I'll talk about why. Since going through all of this on a carnivore diet and beginning to wonder why things went kind of off track for me, especially in terms of my electrolytes, I've since learned that insulin has a crucial role in signaling at the kidney to hold on to electrolytes, specifically sodium, but connected with sodium, insulin is going to affect the resorption, the way your body reabsorbs and holds on to all sorts of electrolytes, all sorts of minerals, sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, and others. And this is essential for optimal human health. This is why I think so many people on ketogenic diets end up having to increase their salt to massive levels, because they're not having enough insulin signaling at the level of the kidney. All of this is fixable with carbohydrates in the diet. As you can see from this study, insulin's impact on renal sodium transport and blood pressure at the level of the kidneys that help our body hold on to these minerals. And I want to make it clear that I do not believe that insulin-induced insulin resistance is the reason that some of you may have obesity or diabetes. Insulin-induced insulin resistance, this idea that eating too many carbohydrates leads to insulin resistance in humans, this has really never been shown in real human clinical data. There are other mechanisms at play at the level of mitochondria. If you don't believe me that carbohydrates are benign for humans, things like glucose or fructose or galactose, consider the fact that the human body makes glucose. And if you don't eat it, your body will make it. That is how essential it is to your physiology. If you fear fructose, I will share a short amount of information in this video to corroborate the assertion that fructose is not harmful for humans, specifically when it is consumed in natural form, quote unquote, in things like fruit and honey, where it always occurs with glucose and it is in a food matrix. Fructose consumed in that way looks very different in human physiology than free fructose, isolated fructose, or processed fructose, that is high fructose corn syrup. I believe that the vast majority of fructose hate, fructose fearing is based around animal studies in rats and mice, which we know have different physiology. Rats and mice do much more de novo lipogenesis with fructose than humans do, significantly more, meaning they make fructose into triglycerides and fat to a significantly greater extent than humans do. So that physiology in rats and mice is very different than our physiology and is not translated to humans. Or those assertions around fructose are based on high fructose corn syrup, processed sugars, or they are looking at animal models where fructose is overfed in isolation without glucose to animals, leading to fructose malabsorption, and that leads to lipopolysaccharide, and therein lies the problem in animal models very clearly. But I want to clearly state that eating carbohydrates, especially in the form of fruit and honey, is not what caused your diabetes, and it is possible to eat moderate amounts of those while you have diabetes and obesity and become healthier. I'll talk about that at the end of this video as well. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about why I don't think ketogenic diets are ideal for humans. High level, there is evidence in humans that ketogenic diets, that is limitation of carbohydrates, leads to increased stress hormones, that is cortisol, epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and glucagon. Now, the cortisol and epinephrine may attenuate long-term, but glucagon is always going to be elevated when you are low carb or limiting your carbohydrates, and glucagon is clearly a stress hormone in humans. There are multiple studies showing that adding carbohydrates to athletes or to humans that are not doing intense exercise improves all sorts of metrics, improves cortisol metrics, improves recovery from exercise, or improves thyroid hormones, this sort of essential thermostat that your body has that tells your body where the metabolic rate should be. And guess what? If you want to stay lean, if you want to be healthy and have energy and feel good and have libido, or if you want to lose weight, you want your body's metabolism to work well. You want your thyroid to be moving your body's thermostat to the highest level possible at all times. So consider some of these downsides of ketogenic diets. Here's a paper: a short-term ketogenic diet impairs markers of bone health. Markers of bone remodeling were impaired after short-term low-carb, high-fat diet. Changes in the thyroid hormonal status in patients receiving ketogenic diet due to intractable epilepsy. Here's another study showing that the thyroid hormones are negatively affected by ketogenic diets. This is done in children. This is done in patients receiving a ketogenic diet due to epilepsy. The conclusions: the ketogenic diet caused thyroid malfunction and L-thyroxine may be required. This is the first report documenting the effect of a ketogenic diet on thyroid function. Thyroid function should be monitored regularly in epileptic patients treated with a ketogenic diet. I would go so far as to say that anyone doing a ketogenic diet, even if that diet is working for you, should have regular checks of TSH, T4, T3, free T3, free T4, and reverse T3. I have very rarely seen optimal levels, especially of total T3 and free T3, in people doing long-term ketogenic diets, which I think is a real clear signal that our bodies thrive with carbohydrates and see carbohydrates as a signal of abundance. you want your thyroid to work well. We know that when your thyroid is not working optimally, there are increased rates of all sorts of things, especially cardiovascular disease. What about cortisol? Cortisol is very clearly a stress hormone that is absolutely induced when you limit carbohydrates in humans. There are studies like this one: dietary macronutrient content alters cortisol metabolism independently of body weight changes in obese men. As you can see in the conclusions, a low carbohydrate diet alters cortisol metabolism independently of weight loss. In obese men, this enhances cortisol regeneration by 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase 1 and reduces cortisol inactivation by A-ring reductases in liver. The authors of this study found that in obese men who were doing low carbohydrate diets, that is 4% carbohydrates, for 4 weeks, levels of cortisol were increased due to reduced inactivation and increased regeneration by an enzyme specifically known as 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase 1. The name of that enzyme isn't important. What is important is the idea that on low carbohydrate diets, more cortisol remains in your body, at least for 4-week trials like this one, because of increased regeneration and decreased deactivation of cortisol. That is not a good thing for humans long term. Excess cortisol leads to all sorts of issues in humans. You do not want your cortisol levels to be higher. Obviously, there are some physiologic utilities to cortisol, specifically a cortisol awakening response first thing in the morning that helps wake you up. But consistently elevated cortisol levels due to stresses induced in the body by limitation of carbohydrates is probably not a good thing for many humans. Returning to the idea of thyroid, specifically, here's another study showing that in 6 healthy males with 11 days of 3 diets, all having the same amount of calories and differing amounts of carbohydrates, specifically 85, 44, and 2% carbohydrates. So in this study, there were healthy males who had 11 days of 3 different diets based on their carbohydrate levels, 85% as carbohydrates, 44% as carbohydrates, and 2% as carbohydrates. And what they found was that all of these diets were isocaloric, but in the lowest level of carbohydrates, what they found was in the men who had levels of carbohydrates at 2% in their diet, there was increased protein catabolism, that is increased breakdown of protein, and lowering of the hormone T3. So very clear in this study that low carbohydrate diets increased protein catabolism and lowered thyroid hormones like T3. It's also been noted repeatedly in exercise studies in men that giving carbohydrates improves free testosterone and decreases cortisol after intensive exercise training. Here's a study showing an example of that. And in those who are exercising or doing intense exercise of any kind, carbohydrate clearly improves the attenuation of the immune system after those exercises. As you can see here in this study very clearly, the authors say consuming carbohydrate, but not glutamine or other amino acids during exercise attenuates the rise in stress hormones, meaning that the stress hormones went up less, such as cortisol, and appears to limit the degree of exercise-induced immunosuppression, at least for non-fatiguing bouts of exercise. So I think it's pretty clear that when it comes to ketogenic diets and exercise performance, there is a benefit to having carbohydrates. When it comes to ketogenic diets and thyroid hormone status, there's a benefit to having carbohydrates. When it comes to ketogenic diets and electrolyte levels, there's a benefit to having carbohydrates in your diet. And when it comes to ketogenic diets and sex hormones like testosterone or free testosterone index, there is a benefit to having carbohydrates in your diet. In my experiment, fruit and honey seem to have been the best carbohydrates for me, along with lactose in raw milk. I've done previous videos on why I don't think fruit is harmful for humans. I've done previous videos on honey, and I've done previous videos on raw dairy, but I will summarize all of my thoughts there. Briefly, I want to mention that I've also done videos on why I'm not a fan of grains, specifically things like oatmeal or quinoa, which contain saponins, which contain phytic acid, which are not degraded to any significant extent with cooking. Specifically in oatmeal, many people's favorite source of carbohydrates, you would need to soak that oatmeal for 3 to 4 days, at room temperature or higher than room temperature, then soak it for another 24 hours in a pH solution of 4 to 5, and then boil it or pressure cook it to have the majority of the phytic acid reduced. There are rigorous protocols that must be followed to reduce any significant amount of the phytic acid in oatmeal. Again, I've done whole videos on oatmeal if you're interested in phytic acid in oatmeal. But I think that in general, grains are not a great source of carbohydrates for humans. As always, if you eat grains and you seem to do well with them, maybe not a big deal, but if you are not thriving, if you are having issues, for a lot of people, cutting grains out, whether it's wheat, oatmeal, quinoa, or for some people even rice, especially brown rice, can be a problem. Now, for the sake of scientific experimentation, I've put white rice into my diet sometimes, and I'll tell you guys that I just don't feel as good with white rice the majority of the time when I eat it. So generally, I don't eat white rice, and my carbohydrates come from fruit and honey and raw milk. Again, do what works for you, but know that the grains, that is oats, wheat, quinoa, rice, these do have more defense chemicals and will need more rigorous processes to be detoxified. If you're having gut issues, if you're having headaches or fatigue or unresolved autoimmune issues, a lot of times getting rid of those is a good idea. The same goes for beans. I've done many videos on beans, why I'm not a huge fan of beans at all. Beans contain significant amounts of phytic acid, digestive enzyme inhibitors, and I think they are a very poor source of nutrition for humans. Again, like the grains, you must go through a rigorous process to detoxify beans. This isn't to say that some people, if they want to soak their beans for 4 or 5 days at 45 degrees centigrade and then put them in an acid solution to sprout them for a day and then pressure cook them, you might be able to eat some beans that are reasonably non-toxic for humans, but that is a lot of work, and clearly those beans do not want to get eaten by humans. So it's not that you can't eat sources of carbohydrates like grains or beans, it's just that they require much, much more intensive preparation to actually be less toxic for humans than things like fruit and honey, and I'll get to those in a moment. For some people, root vegetables are better tolerated than grains or beans, and I think this is reasonable. If you can do white potatoes and you pressure cook them and you're fine with them, great. When I've tried to eat white potatoes, it seems to re-trigger my eczema, so I think that for me at least, this nightshade type of root is not agreeing with my body and my immune system. Again, some people do fine with it. So see what works for you in terms of carbohydrates, but I do think having some sources of carbohydrates in your diet will improve your overall health. The reasons that I've selected fruit and honey is because to me, it just makes sense intuitively that these are the foods that plants kind of want us to eat. Fruit is the colorful seasonal part of fruits. Remember that humans evolved at the equator for most of our existence. So I think that all of us have the mechanisms to eat fruit in significant amounts. If you don't want to eat fruit that's out of season where you are, that's great. But I don't think many of us need to go to that level of stringency with regard to our fruit consumption. Some people don't tolerate all fruit as well as other fruits, but see what works for you. Honey is something that, again, is available all year round at the equator. When I was in Africa with the Hadza, they loved honey. They ate it without any remorse, and I got to share honeycomb with actual larvae in it. And we also got honey from stingless bees, and that honey was some of the best I've ever had in the world. When it comes to fruit, people get kind of triggered, especially in ketogenic and carnivore circles. But the fact remains that there are no well-conducted studies in humans showing that fruit or fruit juice induce any degree of metabolic dysfunction. Now, even in the fructose-fearing world, many of the pundits will say that fruit is okay because it contains fiber, which is not something I'm going to address in this podcast necessarily. I'm not a huge fan of fiber, but if you want to get some fiber in your fruit, that's great. But fruit juice is almost unanimously vilified. I don't really understand why, because when you look at the literature, there are studies upon studies showing that fruit juice is helpful for humans in so many different ways. There are studies showing that watermelon juice improves heart rate variability during an oral glucose challenge and actually attenuates many of the problems that happen when you give somebody pure glucose in a glucose challenge. There are multiple studies with orange juice showing that it improves total antioxidant status and decreases lipid peroxidation in humans. There are studies with cherry juice showing decreased levels of lipid peroxidation as well. There are studies showing that 100% fresh orange juice improved blood glucose and improved insulin levels in healthy subjects. And there are other studies showing that orange juice ingestion decreased lipid peroxidation in healthy adult women. This is just the tip of the iceberg, guys. There are probably 30 to 40 studies with fruit juice alone showing that fruit juice improves everything from lipid peroxidation, glucose indices, insulin sensitivity, and endothelial function. Fruit juice, especially when raw and fresh and not contaminated with processed sugars or high fructose corn syrup, looks to be healthy for humans. Then people will say, well, what about honey? Honey can't possibly be healthy for humans. Honey is known to raise testosterone levels in men, which is probably a good thing. Honey has even been studied in human randomized controlled trials in diabetics and found to lower fasting blood glucose. Yes, I said lower fasting blood glucose. In an 8-week trial, patients were given up to 125 to 150 grams of honey per day at the end of the trial, and they ended up with lower fasting glucose at the end of the trial. Now, notably in this trial, the hemoglobin A1C, an average reflection of the blood sugar, was slightly higher, about 7 to 10 milligrams per deciliter higher blood glucose equivalents in patients getting the honey, which is not surprising when you give a diabetic more carbohydrates, their blood sugar would be slightly higher, but their fasting blood glucose was lower, suggesting improved insulin sensitivity And I suspect that even in diabetics, moderate amounts of honey could be used long-term without any detrimental effects, potentially positive effects. And in fact, there are entire reviews written, like this one, a review of the protective effects of honey against metabolic syndrome. So it's very clear that there's a significant amount of evidence that both fruit and honey can improve all sorts of metrics in line with improved metabolic health in humans. One caveat: adjust your carbohydrate intake to you, to your lifestyle, to how active you are. I think some people have criticized my lifestyle or my recommendation for people to consider adding carbohydrates in the form of fruit and honey or raw milk back to their diets by saying that I'm active or that I live in a place near the equator and I'm getting lots of sun. And I think that those criticisms are well taken, but generally inaccurate. No matter where you live, no matter how active you are, including some carbohydrates in your diet is a reasonable thing. Do you need as many carbohydrates as me? No, you don't. But getting some in your diet, I believe, will help if you are struggling with any of the issues or any of these problems that I mentioned or something like these on a carnivore or ketogenic diet. That's, again, why I'm doing this whole video. When I talk about fruit and honey, some people mention concerns about deuterium. I'll just say briefly about deuterium that I think that the best way to lower your body's levels of deuterium are to have your mitochondrial electron transport chain work very well to make the metabolic water at the end of the electron transport chain, which will be deuterium depleted. And in order to do that, I believe there is strong biochemical and physiologic evidence in humans that you should be eating carbohydrates. I think that if you want to spend tons of money shipping deuterium depleted water across the world, you can, but I don't believe that fruit and honey will have any significant effect on the deuterium levels in most people's bodies, especially in the context of your overall metabolic health and the degree to which your mitochondria work. Some people have also looked at fruit and honey and had fears that they would increase glycation. I don't think there's any solid evidence that it happens at all. There's actually evidence that fructose decreases hemoglobin A1C in humans. And on the flip side, something that I don't think is talked about enough is the idea that ketogenic diets increase advanced glycation end products, specifically things like methylglyoxal, which are not great for humans. As we can see from studies like this, ketogenic diets lead to increased methylglyoxal in the human body. So if you're worried about advanced glycation end products, I would worry a lot less about fruit and honey and a lot more about being in ketosis. Methylglyoxal, as you can see in this study, not a good thing in terms of aging and oxidative stress. You do not want more methylglyoxal being produced in your body. And as you saw in the first study, ketogenic diets clearly increase the amount of methylglyoxal in your cells and in your organism. So at the end of all of this, let me return to the first thing I said. Carnivore diet significantly improved my eczema. I believe that ketogenic diets, carnivore diets have helped so many people. But if you are struggling on these diets, understand that they don't work for everyone. Yes, there is bioindividuality, and perhaps there are some people for which these diets work better than others. Maybe my genes were not adapted to a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet as well as yours. To those of you who are doing carnivore diets and ketogenic diets and thriving, like I said in the beginning, awesome. Keep going. This video is for those in the space who may be thinking about those diets, who may be doing those diets and not finding the results that they want. They may be having low thyroid symptoms, low sex hormone symptoms, low libido, sleep disturbances, weight loss plateaus. And for the reasons I outlined in this video, increased cortisol, decreased thyroid hormone production, increased SHBG, decreased testosterone production, possibly increased advanced glycation end products, coupled with the fact that I don't think you need to fear fruit and honey, natural sources of sugar, lead me to suggest that if you're struggling on either one of those diets, that you consider something like an animal-based diet. Organs, meat, fruit, honey, raw dairy. There are different sources of carbohydrates that you can include. Ultimately, this is about experimenting, figuring out what works for you, but I think it's important to put ideas into this space to offer people levers to pull to try and understand what may be best for you. So with that, that's what I humbly offer is my story of why I quit the carnivore diet. And I believe it's a very valuable, powerful way of eating for a lot of people, but I think there's more to the story and there are better ways to adjust our diets for most humans. See you guys in the next video.